everyone, in this video we're going to be addressing holding and serving. These two steps within the flow of food are kind of your last way of preventing any foodborne illness from happening, and some of the rules are kind of complicated, but hopefully after this video you'll have a better understanding of how these two stages work. The first step we're going to talk about is holding, and the first part of that we're going to talk about is hot holding. So this can be done in a lot of different situations, the first of which is generally buffets because you have a whole lot of food being kept warm for a long period of time. This is also done for things like catering. And then finally, a lot of restaurants are going to be holding dishes for service, so holding things like side dishes or soups or meats for long periods of time in order to serve them during service. There are a few guidelines for holding food, the first of which is to make sure you have a plan for how long this food is going to be held. This means having a specific number of hours that you hold food before you discard it. It's a good idea to know exactly how long you're holding it for food quality reasons, even if it doesn't affect food safety. The second one is extremely important, and that's to not use holding equipment to reheat. You don't want to put cold food into this for it to warm up. The food needs to already be at the temperature of 135 or above before putting it into the holding. This equipment is designed to hold things at that temperature, but it takes a temperature much higher to bring cold food up to a high enough temperature. If you do not make sure that you're using the holding equipment properly, it could take hours and hours for that food to reheat. You are required to check the temperature every 4 hours, but it's a good idea to check it every hour or every 2 hours so that if temperatures aren't correct, you can apply a corrective action and make sure that you're able to keep that food instead of discarding it. Never use the temperature gauge on holding equipment to check the temperature of food. Make sure that you're using a thermometer. The holding equipment temperature is just there for informational purposes to let you know what temperature you've set it to. That doesn't mean that the food is at that particular temperature. Finally, always make sure to have a sneeze guard over the food, especially if customers are serving it. You don't necessarily have to have one if just your food workers are going to be handling it, but it's not a bad idea to have it across the board. This keeps bodily fluids such as particles coming from coughing or sneezing getting onto the food. Sometimes, due to certain circumstances, you might need to hold food without temperature control. This means there's nothing underneath the pans to keep food hot or cold. So, there's a few reasons this might happen. Sometimes you don't have hot or cold holding equipment available, things like catering or a lack of utilities at a site. This can happen fairly often, so it's important that you have a plan in place for how to handle these situations. There are different rules for holding the food based on whether it's cold or hot, so we're going to review what those rules are. Holding cold food without temperature control is pretty common, especially now that things like charcuterie boards are really popular. So there's a few rules that go into this to make sure that everything is safe along the way. The first of which is to make sure that it's kept at or below 41 degrees Fahrenheit before setting it out. So make sure that there's been no time temperature abuse in that process to ensure that things are safe for as long as possible. It's also vitally important when holding food without temperature control that you label it with the time that you took it out of cold storage and also the time to throw it out. And that time should be 6 hours after. If it exceeds 70 degrees Fahrenheit, you need to throw it out immediately. At that temperature range, between 70 and 120 degrees, bacteria multiply very rapidly, so make sure that you throw out any items that reach that temperature. After any cold food has been held without temperature control, you need to throw it out. Don't put it back into refrigeration to use later. It's almost impossible to keep track of how much time it's spent outside of refrigeration, and you don't want to have any risk of any bacteria that multiplied during that time out of refrigeration staying in the food and then making someone sick later on. Finally, the amount of time that any food spends outside of refrigeration cannot exceed 6 hours. So at that point, it needs to be thrown away and not served to customers anymore. Hot food can be held without temperature control as well, but it's not done as often as cold food because it's so detrimental to the quality. You will see this sometimes with lunches that are dropped off by catering companies, and in those cases you would leave labels on the particular items so that people would know what time to get rid of them. As with cold food, there are some guidelines. First of all, it has to be kept at 135 or above before you set it out. Once you do that, you want to label it with the time that it was removed from hot holding and the time to throw it out. This is especially important if you're just leaving the items for the customer to deal with. You want to make things abundantly clear. The maximum amount of time that it should be left out is 4 hours. So that would be the time that you're going to put on the label for it to be thrown out. And finally, if it's not used, it needs to be thrown out and not put into refrigeration. Now, obviously, you need to direct anybody that you're leaving the food with to have those things, but as long as you've let them know, your liability ends there. The next category we're going to talk about in the flow of food is serving. And one of the most important things to think about when you're talking about serving is gloves. In general, gloves have to be worn when you're handling any ready-to-eat food. Ready-to-eat food is food that's not going to undergo any more preparation, washing, or cooking before it's served to the customer. Sometimes using gloves isn't practical, sometimes you don't have them available, and sometimes other things just make more sense. So it's important to know that you can also use tongs because you won't have direct contact with the food. Tongs are really great for things like rolls or for salads. It helps out a lot with making sure that you're not touching food, and it works well for a lot of things that may not necessarily make sense to touch because they might be too hot or because they're difficult to hold on to. Deli papers are also a great option because they allow you to be able to hold on to food without any previous hand washing. This also works great for customers for buying things out of bakery cases like donuts or muffins because they might not necessarily be washing their hands the way they should be. And finally, you can use spatulas or any other utensils that make sense, like ladles or spoons. As long as you don't have direct contact with food, it doesn't really matter what type of utensil that you use or which type of tool you use. When it comes to serving things on buffet lines or in the kitchen, it's important to keep a few things in mind. The first thing is that every single item gets its own utensil, and those utensils need to be changed out periodically. Also, as you can see in this picture, every single handle needs to easily extend out of the top of the container to make sure that you don't have something that's come into contact with people's hands coming into contact with food that people are going to eat. When servers or any other employee are serving food to guests, there's definitely some guidelines that you want to keep in mind. The first of these guidelines is that you should always hold any plates and bowls by the bottom of the plate or by the side. You don't really ever want to touch the top of the plate or the food itself because you don't want any bare hand contact with ready-to-eat food. Glasses need to be held by the side or by the bottom or by the stem. This is super important because you want to make sure that your hands are not going inside of the glass and touching any of the liquid that your customers are going to drink. All silverware needs to be held by the handle and not by the tines of the fork or the bowl of the spoon. You pretty much never want to touch a surface with bare hands that is going to come in contact with food and therefore come into contact with customers. There are some don'ts when it comes to handling food as well. The first of which is don't ever touch RTE or ready-to-eat food with your bare hands. You should always be using some of the methods that we talked about earlier in the video. Always use a scoop or tongs for ice. And also make sure that your scoop is stored outside of your ice bin so that things that have come into contact with your hands are not coming into contact with food. If you're at a fine dining restaurant or somewhere that sets the table before customers come in, there's a few guidelines for the way this works. If you remove the place settings as the guests are sitting down, you don't have to rewash those individual items of silverware before the next guests come. The other option is to clean and sanitize any of your silverware, plates, cups, spoons before your next guests come. If it has been on the table while a customer has been sitting down, it must be cleaned and sanitized. Sometimes you can reserve certain items in food service, but there are some that you definitely cannot reserve after they have been served to a customer. The first thing is any food items from any dishes. So if they've been open in front of a customer, you can't reserve it. You can't reserve any open containers of condiments and sauces such as salsa, ranch, or ketchup to any other customers. After it's been on the table, it must be thrown away. You also can't reserve any bread or rolls once they've been on a customer's table. So, if you're ever at Olive Garden and you're getting ready to leave, taking the breadsticks with you isn't tacky, you're just making sure they follow food service guidelines. Any garnishes like herbs or kale that are put on a plate also cannot be reserved. There are some things that you can reserve, one of which is any sealed containers of condiments and sauces, so sauce packs, ketchup packs, or things like crackers. You can also reserve things like ketchup, mustard, and mayonnaise as long as they're in their original containers or in squeeze bottles like these or in dispensers. And finally, you can reserve coffee creamer that's in sealed containers. This includes the refrigerated kind and the ultra high temperature processed kind, but you cannot reserve it if it's been in an open container on a customer's table. So in some food service operations, the customer is going to serve themselves, either from a buffet or from a display case. When customers are serving themselves, one of the things you want to make sure of is that all food is labeled well to prevent allergies or any confusion. You also want to check the temperature at least every 4 hours. Hot food has to be 135 degrees Fahrenheit or higher, and cold food has to be 41 degrees or below. I would check the temperature every 1 to 2 hours, however, to make sure that if the temperatures are not correct, you have time to do a corrective action of getting the food hotter or colder. In general, you can't have raw meat on a buffet, but there are some exceptions in that you can have sushi or raw shellfish, ready to cook meat, or Mongolian barbecues can have food that's ready to be cooked as well. It's also important to use clean plates because sometimes customers might touch a utensil to the plate in order to get food off of a spoon or something. You also want to make sure you use correct and clean utensils for each individual food item. Sometimes in grocery stores or in service stations, you might have bulk food like bakery items or coffee, flour, or nuts that are available for customers to serve themselves into containers. There's a few guidelines that go along with this. These don't have to be labeled if you're not making any claims about how healthy they are or anything they can do for your body. If no local labeling laws exist, and that would need to be looked up in your individual areas, or if it's made on site or at a processing plant specifically for your location. Many grocery stores and convenience stores have off-site locations that they use to prepare the food for any of the different stores in their area. Those would not require a label. Labeling is always a good idea, however, even if it's not required, because it helps out with any allergy issues and just eliminates an additional level of liability for you. If you're ever doing any off-site catering, it's important to use food-grade insulated containers. These need to have that NSF seal that we talked about before because they'll lose or gain 1 degree an hour, so they have a very good likelihood that they'll keep food within the correct temperature range. Any delivery vehicles you use need to be clean and sanitized, and every item needs to be labeled with a use by date and time and how to reheat or store it. Labels like these, when you're holding food without temperature control in any sort of storage, or to indicate to anyone that's doing your catering for you how long your food will last, when it should be discarded, and how it should be stored. Check and ensure that your site has utilities, and if it doesn't, make some sort of arrangements for things like hand washing or electricity you might need for keeping food hot. In those cases, you can use things like sterno burners or things like that to keep your food hot, or ice, but you want to make sure that you know ahead of time if you need to make those provisions. Any food that's stored and taken to a catering site, you want to keep any raw food, like raw meat, away from any ready-to-eat food. So for example, if you're doing a cookout on site, then you would want to keep your raw burgers away from things like potato salad. That means that they need to be in a completely separate container so that there's no cross-contamination risk. The last thing we're going to talk about in this video is food vending machines. And these are seen often in manufacturing locations or in office complexes. And as usual, there's some rules. The first thing is that any dates on any food in the vending machine need to be checked daily. This is to ensure that things don't stay in there longer than the 7 days that are required. You also want to make sure that you're serving food at the highest quality. This feeds into the second one, which is any of your prepared food like salads or sandwiches has to be disposed of after 7 days. This is to prevent listeria from being able to grow, because listeria is able to grow at refrigerated temperatures. You also want to make sure that any cold foods are at 41 or below and any hot food is at 135 or above. Sometimes the fancier vending machines will even cook the food for you, but any food that hasn't been warmed yet needs to be kept at that 41 or below temperature range. Any TCS food like milk or yogurt has to be in its original containers. And finally, any fruit that has edible peels like apples or pears should be wrapped. Things like oranges or bananas that you don't eat the peel don't have to be wrapped. But this is why you often see fruit that's individually wrapped in things like school cafeterias. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.